Welcome back. You're watching Political Exchange, where we continue our discussion on attitudes in Kenya concerning the election, the judicial system, and the security forces. Mr. Tutoro, before we went to the break, we were talking about the fact that the group between ages of 18 and 21, that only 39% of those people were in fact registered voters, with the potential, of a large section of young people being disenfranchised. How big a problem do you think this presents for Kenya's political elite in terms of just the legitimacy of the upcoming poll?
Yes, I mean, one of the real issues there is when we asked those young people if they weren't registered to vote, why weren't they? And 54% told us that they planned to register, but 33% said they didn't have the proper documentation. And so I think there's going to have to be some process set up to ensure that these young folks get their opportunity to vote.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the issue of getting the right documentation is a matter for government, and you were saying that this is the first in a series of surveys. Do we have any information at the moment about the amount of people that actually still require the necessary documents to be able to become eligible voters?
Yeah, we don't have that information. You know, the IEBC just released this week their education program, which for the voting population, and I think that's going to be particularly important. But 84% of eligible voters have said they have heard of the IEBC. So we have 16% that haven't heard of it, and we have 50% of the voting population that have heard of the IEBC saying that they're very confident that the IEBC can manage the entire electoral process. So, I think there's a sort of a way to go in terms of getting voters franchised to vote.
Mm-hmm. Now, just take us through whether you polled opinion on the various candidates that are, running for this election, and what we were finding, and if there were any interesting breakdowns in terms of which candidates are appealing to, what sections of the population in terms of that age or generational divide.
Absolutely. So what we know is that if we look at the intent to vote for a particular candidate, the prime minister is significantly ahead of both the deputy prime minister Kenyatta and the MP Mr. Ruto. So he has a significant lead. He has among that population 28.6% of the vote, as opposed to the deputy prime minister with 21.5% and the MP Mr. Ruto with 14.5%. But if we restrict that to registered voters, so this is the population that said yes, we are registered to vote, then things change a little bit. The prime minister and the deputy prime minister are essentially in a statistical tie for votes, and followed by Mr. Ruto. And I think there's another important part of this issue in that 6.5%, so roughly 7% of Kenyans are undecided on who they will vote for.
Mm-hmm. That is quite an interesting issue that 7% are not clear on whether they want any or of the three candidates that are running. What were the reasons that people forwarded in the survey for their indecision?
Yeah, at this point, we're not getting into that. The issue is that there are so many candidates still in the race that it becomes very hard to dive into individual decision making. I expect that as the race narrows down, then that'll be the time to understand those issues. We do know one thing from a survey that we did in April of this year in Kenya. This was not this survey, but a survey as part of the Gallup World Poll. We asked Kenyans what was the most important issue that the government should address in the next 12 months, and there it was it was corruption and creating jobs. So I think those are some issues that maybe will, depending on the candidate's philosophy, will impact voters.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you were saying that the picture changes slightly when one looks at registered voters. Take us through which candidate will be most disadvantaged if the Electoral Institute there doesn't get its act together and fast track people who need to actually get the proper documents to become eligible voters.
Sure. Well, right now we know some basic demographic information about the intent to vote for a particular candidate, and we see that the Prime Minister, Mr. Odinga, has a significant statistical lead in terms of male voters. He's tied with Mr. Kenyatta among female voters. But he also had the Prime Minister has a significant lead among those 18 to 21. So to me that's an important area to concentrate on. Once you look at the other age groups, then things again appear to get closer among the various candidates. Mm-hmm. Although still, I just want to say, Mr. Odinga, both with eligible voters, has a significant lead. But when we go to registered voters, he's tied with the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, whilst generational mix is important, the other issue in Kenya is, of course, also just the geography of the place. And we were speaking earlier about just logistically making sure that voters actually get to polls. Just in terms of the spread in geographic terms, take us through what kind of significant differences one found in various parts of Kenya. And does that tell us something about the institutions, its legitimacy, and also support for particular candidates?
Yeah, one of the things that we really tried to look into was this undecided vote that I talked about earlier, and there you see some very different situations if you look at the regions of Kenya. You can look at some regions like Central and Coast, where if you look at the breakdown of undecided in those regions, those are very small numbers. In fact, they're not statistically different from zero, and when we look at it that way. But in some regions there are some fairly high numbers, and even a small number in some regions is very important, because you can look at the Rift Valley, very large population for Kenya, and about 5% of the voters there are still undecided. So it may be that candidates decide to target particular areas to go after that undecided group.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, ethnicity is a big issue. We saw with the 2008 violence that it was ethnically rooted. Does the survey tell us anything in terms of, how people are divided, and whether this will, whether ethnicity, if mobilized for narrow political ends, will be a factor in the way in which the elections will go down and how it will be perceived?
Right. One of the issues we have, and it's an issue with all surveys, is that when we start trying to break down, what's behind a particular number. So we know that about 23% of Kenyans expect a repeat of the violence. But if we wanted to get statistically and look into those groups, that all of a sudden these groups become very small, and it becomes hard to make statements about the reliability of our data. So at this point, with a sample size of 2,400 that we surveyed in this survey, that becomes a really difficult question to address.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were speaking earlier about a survey that you did prior to the one that you've just released that spoke about the most pressing issues being jobs and corruption. Even though you don't have recent statistical data, do you think that those two issues remain the priorities for Kenyans as we gear up for next year's poll?
Yeah, we absolutely will survey again on that particular issue. And and see if those two, or maybe there's been some change over time. So we'll come back and report on those numbers in a subsequent poll.
I wanted to return to the issue of the Constitution. Your survey finds that 69% believes laws will be better followed or enforced given the new Constitution. And I was asking, what about the new Constitution fills Kenyans with this kind of confidence? Was it the process? Is it the provisions? What do we know about the Constitution that gives Kenyans the confidence in the political system?
Well, I think you're raising a very interesting question, because when we asked Kenyans if they thought that the whole Constitution would be implemented, only 39% of Kenyans thought that. But they also thought, 69% thought that the laws would be better followed and enforced. So, there may be some issues there of trying to, again, dwell deeper into thinking about the Constitution.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to the other surveys coming out in the series. That's where we will have to leave it for now. Join us again for another edition of Political Exchange. I'm Karima Brown. Goodbye.